Thank you very much, Anjuman. I see that we have started recording, and welcome, folks. It's my honor and privilege to put Rebecca Parsons on the spot. Rebecca is the Chief Technology Officer at Thoughtworks and has kindly offered to join me in a conversation looking about learning from the leaders, experimenting, adapting, and responding to COVID-19. And when we were chatting about the session, what we looked at is Thoughtworks in particular is involved with many different organizations. I also, in my day job with IC Agile and also the work that I do with InfoQ, get to see a fair amount of different organizations and things that are happening, and we wanted to share some ideas. But first, perhaps before we get into it, Rebecca, welcome. Maybe some of our audience don't know who you are. Do you want to tell us a tiny bit?
Okay, well, as Shane said, I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Thoughtworks. We are a global software consulting organization located in, I guess we're in 16 countries now, scattered across the globe. I've been with Thoughtworks for over 20 years, which is hard to imagine. During that time, when I joined, we were, around 100 people or so, and we now have over 8,000 scattered across the globe. So I've seen a lot of changes. As Shane points out as well, as a consultancy, we get to see many different organizations across different domains, across different scales, some of them big multinationals, some startups and scale-ups. And so we've been able to see how different organizations have been coping with COVID, and some patterns, if you will, about what works and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's start maybe just looking inwards at Thoughtworks. How did Thoughtworks adapt? What were the big shifts? I know for yourself, you used to spend more time on planes than I did, and that was saying a lot. And now you've been home for a year.
Yes, yeah, I've we in many of our offices, standard procedure was to be on a plane, work on client sites. We actually had to start adapting sooner than many organizations because of we have a significant presence in China. And so although most things didn't start being impacted until the March timeframe, we were actually already making changes to the way we work and our plans in early to mid-February. And although it varied by country, because we do have quite a bit of independence for our different managing directors in the different countries, we pretty quickly settled on a set of principles. The first being, of course, making sure we got our people safe. We did have people who were stranded outside of their home country that we had to get home. We had one particular situation where someone had started a permanent transfer to North America from India, and he had gone over. His family was back until the kids finished their school year, and so they were going to be separated for an indeterminate amount of time. And so we actually figured out how to get him back to reunited with his family in India. So we had several situations like that. But the other thing that we really wanted to focus on was really the well-being of our people. So different countries took different approaches, but many of them had, I particularly like the name North America chose for it, Wellness Wednesdays. And so they would have a session every Wednesday on some aspect of physical and mental well-being. Other countries have done yoga sessions on a regular basis, but we're trying to do lots of things to look after both the physical and the mental well-being of our people, and that's been an important part. But one of the advantages that we had is that we've never really had a home office mentality. Our leadership team is scattered across the globe. We would do, say, once a quarter in-person meetings, but basically we run the company in a remote fashion. And so the cessation of in-person meetings didn't really affect our ability to lead the company, because that's just how we did things. I kind of chuckle, when people say, "Oh, I'm having to spend all this time on Zoom," and it's like, this has been my life for the last 5 years. Having hour upon hour of Zoom meetings. So it's in some ways it's been a significant change, and in other ways it really hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Except I don't spend time in taxis.
And aluminium tubes.
Yes.
Flying from place to place. Yeah. So I'm gonna say that there's some things that we're seeing where organizations are almost falling into two categories. My experience, similar to yours, I'm used to working remote. I see Agile as a completely remote organization. I've been doing this for the last 4 years. So lockdown for me was pretty easy. I've got my my office. I'm surrounded by computer screens. Yes, there's a bed in the background because it's a spare room, but it's a dedicated space. We're pretty fortunate, I think, to have that, because a lot of people are sharing the dining room table. They've got a limited bandwidth. How do we support those people? And what are some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, and that's been a challenge. One of the things I think that has happened is people are quite a bit more forgiving of the interruptions than they were before. It used to be, if you were living a life like ours, there would never be anybody walking behind you in the background. You would never hear a dog bark. None of those things. People have become much more accepting of the fact that we're all working out of our houses. And so to expect to have, a pristine hour where there's no dog barking or something, it's okay now for people to be individuals with families and lives. I think the real challenge is for the families with children in school, particularly less privileged families. There are stories of kids having to go sit in a park near a Starbucks or near a library so that they could get wireless access, so that they could do school, because they didn't have those facilities at home. And that's something that I think as a society, we're going to have to reckon with the fallout from that, because it is just increasing already. The gap between the haves and the have-nots, that gap is just getting larger. another trend that we see, and disproportionately, it's women who are being affected by having the kids at home. It was only about 3 months or so into the lockdowns, there was a study that had already shown a dip in the number of research papers being generated by women. Research papers generated by men, that number had not decreased. But for women, it had significantly decreased even after 3 months. And all of the employment statistics, women are leaving the workforce, in greater numbers simply because they can't manage it. We had, in fact, one of our people, she was due a sabbatical, which she had kept putting off, and said, I've got to take my sabbatical now, or I'm going to quit, because I just, I can't do my job and take care of the kid. And she and her husband are both in technology. They're both very well off. This wasn't an issue of money. This was an issue of time and stamina. And she said, I just can't do it anymore, and took a sabbatical.
And not many of us have the opportunity to just take a sabbatical.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what are the successful organizations that you've seen? What are they doing to overcome these problems and challenges to help people?
Well, part of it is, first and foremost, being conscious of what are the things that have been lost, and what are the ways to make up for it. And a lot of that comes down to this sense of community, feeling like you're connected to something. And one of the strategies that we've employed, for example, with larger group meetings that have now gone remote, is you actually schedule mingle time. But you have to schedule it. You're not just going to run into people, or there's not going to be a set of people who are collected in front of the coffee and tea table, putting their beverages together, right? Because everybody's going to their own kitchens to do that. And so we've started scheduling mingle time. And it can't just, the other thing that we've learned, you still have to allow people to get a break. And so, for example, you schedule a break, but then block out an extra 15 minutes on top of what you already had decided you needed for a break, and that's your mingle time. And it actually works. I was skeptical at first. I mean, we're going to schedule serendipity, but people actually did start to have the kinds of conversations that you would hear when a group of people went off to get a snack or refresh their coffee or whatever. And figuring out other ways to recreate that sense of belonging and community outside of the work context. One of the other things one of our countries has done is they are doing sessions at the end of the workday, so it's after official hours, with things like a watercolor class or gardening tips, or bread making, to allow people to interact on something other than their day job, because that is an awful lot as well of what happens when people are just chatting as they're walking to the bathroom on a break, or you run into somebody in the hall. It's not always just about work. It's, oh, how are the kids, how's the new puppy, all of those kinds of things. And with all of the work environment moving to this screen, you have to make space. You have to be deliberate to make space for that interaction that isn't just about what are your revenue figures, or is the build broken, or all of the kinds of work that we are now doing through this screen.
So you touch on those sort of things. What else? Yeah, how do we bring new people on board? How do we give them the feeling of our organizational culture?
That has been a real challenge. We have we hired two people. One, she started in September, just after our big face-to-face meeting. She couldn't actually start quickly enough to be at that meeting. And so the vast majority of the people, she's never actually met in person. And we had another person who started actually the day before the lockdowns began in the UK. And so again, she's never met any of the people that she interacts with. And so much of it does have to be very intentional. And I think one of the positive side effects of this has been you have to be able to articulate what are the important aspects of the culture. It just doesn't emerge in interactions anymore because we're not interacting in a space. And so we've had to actually do a better job of articulating what is it that matters to us? What are those cultural imperatives? And be able to explain it, because it's not, you don't have the chance for that to just happen by osmosis. And I do think a lot of it does depend too on what the culture was to begin with. Organizations that were very place oriented. Everybody came to the same place. Everybody worked in the same way. Now, all of a sudden, that's not happening. And for some people, if you've never had to work independently, you're used to having somebody standing over you all the time, watching to make sure that you're doing your job. It's quite an adjustment, both for the person, but also now the managers are, how am I going to be able to know that the people are getting their work done? And so if you have an organization that was in the before times based on trust and transparency and openness, then the transition was actually relatively okay. If you had an organization that was based on command and control and a level of micromanagement, those organizations are struggling, because it's a whole lot harder to micromanage people when they're sitting in their own house. They can do things like turn off their camera.
The 7 hours of Zoom calls, the Zoom fatigue is a real thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So for those organizations that are struggling with the shift, what's some advice? What's some things they could consider doing differently?
I think one important aspect is to focus on outcomes, because you can measure outcomes. Very often in those command and control organizations, the focus is on the activity and the implementation. What are you doing right now? As opposed to what is the outcome that you were trying to achieve, and trying to make that mental shift. I'm not going to worry about how you do this, but this needs to be done by Tuesday. And then you can see whether or not it was done by Tuesday. And so it's by making that shift to thinking about outcomes, that can make a big difference. But but what you do have to deal with is if an organization doesn't feel like they can trust their people, that is going to be a very hard shift to make. Yes, you can go to the extremes of keystroke loggers and all of those kinds of surveillance tools. But that will only increase that sense of alienation. And an important part of maintaining the culture and the cohesion of an organization is to battle that sense of alienation. And so if you feel like somebody is surveilling you, that is only going to increase that sense of alienation. But it is a real cultural shift. And we had clients that in the past would never have allowed us to do any work for them unless we were sitting in their offices. And it's been a revelation to them when, oh, well, actually, you're still getting work done. And so those organizations are getting an existence proof that things can work differently. And I think that's been a benefit for them to the point where some of them have said, okay, yes, when we do get to the point where we can meet in person again, there are certain things we want to go back to doing in person, but we're not going to go back to always having everybody in the same room, because we now know that we don't need it.
So with this, we don't need it all the time. Location independence was a topic you and I touched on earlier on before we came online. What's that meaning? What's happening with that?
Well, I think a big part of it is allowing teams to form in a way where location doesn't matter. Now, I will caveat this: you can't get away from time zones. It's very late where Shane is. It's very early where I am. But if you're relatively time zone aligned, you can form teams and find the right person wherever they are. We have people, for example, who, again, privileged people, they might have had a country house. And when things really started to get bad in the cities, they all just went to the country house. And that didn't matter. As long as they had their computer and had their broadband connection, they could be anywhere. And it brings with it challenges. But we are starting to see we're starting to see organizations hire across country boundaries in ways that they haven't before. We have people who are have been poached from us out of our Brazil office, for example, by American companies that are paying them an American salary, and they continue to live in Brazil. Yeah, it sounds like we've got somebody off mute. And so these location boundaries, they don't matter in the way they did before.
What about the and you touched on it, hiring across country? What about the HR and legal situations there? How are organizations tackling that one? Because is it a limiting factor?
Yes, it is. as a global organization, it's something that we've had to deal with. You, depending on which country you're in, you might, there are different regulations around when you are liable for tax in a particular country. If you work in one country but live in another country, well, what does that mean? What are the tax implications? The legal ramifications are significant because employment law is also so different. Some organizations take it upon themselves to sort that out. Other organizations will just say, okay, well, I'll let you live wherever you want to live, but it's your responsibility to sort out all of the legal implications. Sometimes that might result in something more like a contractor relationship as opposed to, you know, a full-time employee. But it is a significant issue, and I think that this one of the consequences of the pandemic will probably be more organizations feeling like they want to take the time to sort out, okay, how do I make this as easy as possible for my employees? Because I do think this is, you know, we are going to be in a more remote world going forward.
So what are the we've touched on a few of them, particularly the lack of trust culture, but what are some of the other anti-patterns that you've seen?
One thing, and I actually noticed this in myself. We have to be a whole lot more intentional about the care and feeding of relationships. Even in an organization like ours, where we're all used to being remote, you can start to notice that degradation of the strength of the relationships unless you are very intentional about it. It's very easy with this screen to just think about, okay, I have my meeting for an hour and I'm going to focus just on that. Whereas when you're face to face, you get that couple of minutes before people come into the conference room when you're meeting, and you know, oh gee, I went to a concert last night. All of those little things. I do think a real anti-pattern is this focus on we are just going to do work, and not making space for that. It also, there are lots of things that we do when we're in the same room that don't translate. So the facilitation patterns have to change. The kind of tools that we use have to be different. There's a group that twice a year we get together to create an artifact. And the first time I tried to do this remote, what was really missing was that ability for people to stand up and cluster in front of a wall and point and interact. And we've gotten to the point that there are some tools that kind of allow that to happen, but it's still difficult. You know, Zoom breakout rooms are great, but it's a lot more effort to be able to flit from one breakout room to another than it is to rearrange yourself, in a group of people and, ask a question of this person over here and then go listen to this conversation over there. And so I think being mindful of what it actually takes to get a successful outcome when everybody is remote. I do think it's going to be a valuable lesson for people to learn. I know many times I've been in meetings where I was one of the few people who wasn't in the room. And that's incredibly difficult because people in the room, they tend to talk to one another. And so making that shift, there's a leveling of the playing field, if you will, that happens when everybody is remote, that changes those interaction patterns.
Mm-hmm. Now, that touches on something that I'm seeing in some organizations starting, as things are starting to open up, the concept of the hybrid, where you've got some people in the office and some people remote, and how is that working? How is that looking? Have you seen much of that?
Yes, and we've had lots of internal discussions around different models. So even if you do have some people physically together, we've started calling it remote first. So if one person's remote, everybody's remote. So even if people are in the office, they go to different conference rooms and get on their own Zoom as individuals. And so, you keep that kind of level playing field. Making a hybrid work, it depends on the kind of activity that is going on. But it is very easy to fall into the trap in a hybrid model where the people who are together are doing all of the work. And you've got somebody in the background, hey, wait a minute, I want to say something, and they can't get a word in edgewise because nobody pays attention to them. And for certain kinds of activities, that's probably okay. But we have to be very conscious of not making the people who are remote second-class citizens in those kinds of interactions.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I'd like to explore with you, and you've touched on it, where is the location independence. What is this doing for diversity in our organizations? Is it helping? Or you also mentioned the impact on women in the workforce, and how that inequality is in many ways being exacerbated. So what's happening there?
Well, once you get to the point of being able to accept a remote workforce, that does allow you to go where the talent is, as opposed to having to have the talent come to you. And so it is opening up the possibilities for hiring in places that organizations simply couldn't recruit from before. However, there are still barriers to that. Is there sufficient telecommunications infrastructure to allow the kind of high fidelity interaction? My colleagues in Australia are often not on video because the Australian internet just isn't up to the task. They're constantly complaining about the Australian internet. There are communities in all countries where you just don't have the level of infrastructure to support it. But if you take those caveats aside, yes, this should make it easier for us as organizations to go to where the talent is, as opposed to having to either bring the talent to us or just hire from whatever pool we're looking at the moment. We do, though, have to address the issues of the unequal burden of, and of course, much of that will get better is once schools can go back to being in person. It doesn't solve it completely, but that certainly makes it better. But one of the advantages, again, of this location independence, and if we can get shifted to this notion of measuring outcomes rather than activity, is you get much more potential for flexible working. If we start to look at the nature of work as being an individual has to carry out some tasks to get to an outcome, and we can schedule that in a way, then, well, maybe I like to work from 3 o'clock in the morning to 7, and then spend some time with my kids, and then maybe a few hours here, a few hours there. So if as the nature of the work changes, I do think it does provide opportunities for addressing some of the issues that we have around inequality, and certainly increases our access to talent. I have heard a couple of companies are looking at just saying, okay, this is what this job, this is what I will pay for this job. I don't care whether you live in China or San Francisco or Kansas or Mexico. I'm going to pay this much for this job. I'm not sure in the long run how well that's going to work out for them, but that is establishing this notion from now on, we are a fully remote organization.
I think I'm sort of running out of questions. But anything you would like to bring that I haven't brought?
Well, I want to go back to this notion of community, because I think this is something that has really increased in importance. It is difficult to maintain that sense of belonging in an organization when everybody is scattered. And so the techniques that have been used to, say, maintain and grow open source communities, or different kinds of membership organizations and such, companies are having to learn that. And one of the things that I feel is underappreciated at times is simply this fact of, well, we have to work to help our people feel like they belong. People always talk about the war on talent, and this is just making it worse, because organizations really have to be intentional about making sure people feel like they belong, or all loyalty is going to be lost. And you take the location out of the equation, you take the sense of belonging out of the equation, and I think we're going to see a lot of churn in our in our workforces unless organizations are very intentional about, remember, this is why you're here. This is what we feel is important, and this is something that will hopefully compel you to want to continue to work for us, even though you can't go in. I mean, the beanbag chairs and the casual environments and all of those things, they're meaningless now. And so I think for organizations who think carefully about their culture, their purpose, their value proposition to their employees, they are going to be better situated as we move through this. And for organizations that think of their people as collections of molecules that serve their purpose, I think they're going to struggle to hold on to their people, because their people will have many more options than they had in the past.
So any other things, any other trends that you think that this is accelerating, things that might have been on the horizon, that this has pushed forward? So that importance of culture is definitely one of them. I would say that the shift to remote has been massively accelerated, but it was underway already to a certain extent in 2019 and early 2020. Anything else you can think of that has been accelerated like that?
I do think there's been an acceleration of the tools that support remote working. And as we mentioned earlier, but both you and I have been doing a lot of remote stuff long before COVID hit. And some of the tools were great, and some of them just really weren't up to the task. And the strain on the infrastructure and tooling, as well as the massive opportunity, has really pushed the development of some of these remote tools, facilitation techniques, all of those kinds of things to facilitate that. I think also there's been an acceleration. One of the consequences, I think, of this move to remote has really been an acceleration of a level of decentralization. It's really hard to maintain a strong center when everything's scattered. And so you've got organizational pressures to decentralization of authority, decentralization of processes. And so I think that this notion of remote working is accelerating a decentralization of processes more broadly. And one of the things that is hopefully a consequence of that is resilience. And when you think about it from an organizational perspective, organizations for a long time have been focused on cost reduction. and we saw this early on, for example, when China first shut down, and companies started to realize, oh, wait a minute, my supply chain relies on being able to get things in and out of China, and I can't do that anymore. And they had no resilience in their supply chains. And so I think one other thing that is being accelerated is an increased focus, not just on, is this the most efficient supply chain, for example, but is this also a resilient supply chain? And that shift from thinking just about cost and efficiency, we're now thinking, oh, but I also have to worry about resilience.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And we want to open this up at this point to questions from the audience. So, folks, please feel free to turn on your camera, come off mute, and fire questions at us.
Hi, Rebecca, and hi, Shane. This is Parul.
Hi, Para.
I had a question, like in this time when everybody is working remotely, how important does psychological safety becomes for creating that environment? Because organizations from top down also need to do that. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
I'm going to say it's from my perspective and summarizing, I think, or reflecting on some of the stuff Rebecca told us, it is absolutely crucial, and psychological safety has become a buzzword. It's become the catchphrase of the day, but in most organizations, it's not actually there. Or am I being cynical, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think it's easy to say, well, this has to be, this environment is some way safer because you don't have the physical interaction. You don't have the ability to be physically harassed if you are if you're not physically in the same place. But I do think that particularly for organizations that weren't built on trust and are more command and control, I think actually this would have a negative impact on psychological safety, in part because whatever control structure was there in the workplace, now you don't have a place to hide from it, because that control structure has to have come into your home. And so to some extent, I think people have lost ground. If they were already in a place where they felt it was psychologically unsafe, that's only gotten worse.